Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of Harry Truman, and the focus is Potsdam and dropping the bomb. The year is 1945. Throughout World War II, the big three for the Allies had been United States, Franklin Roosevelt, Great Britain, Winston Churchill, and Russia, Joseph Stalin. Those three really ran the war for the Allies, but Franklin Roosevelt is now dead. He's been replaced as President of the United States by Harry Truman, and so Truman would be going to the upcoming conference at Potsdam on the outskirts of Berlin, July the 17th of 1945. The war in Europe is over, but still a number of decisions to make about the future of Europe, particularly Eastern Europe. Harry Truman's first chance on the international stage. He's been president for only a couple of months. Now, he did have a couple of solid weeks to prepare and really focus on this, on the journey on the USS Augusta. He really was focusing on his principal leaders, both military and civilian, including Averill Harriman, who is the U.S. ambassador to Russia, who was warning Truman that the Russians had really started to back away from a number of their commitments they had made just a few months before at Yalta. And then he went a little further in his advice to Truman. He said, look, we must clearly recognize that the Soviet program is the establishment of totalitarianism, ending personal liberty and democracy as we know it and respect it. We got to be on the lookout for this. Truman spent most of his time on this 2-week trip with his new Secretary of State, James Byrnes, also with his Chief of Staff, Admiral William Leahy, who is a holdover from the Roosevelt administration. Gets to Potsdam. The first leader he meets with is Winston Churchill, spends a couple of hours with him, finds him a bit verbose, which was not all that surprising, but it was still off to a good start. Truman had that afternoon off, and so he decided to go into Berlin. He wanted to see the German capital, and was completely devastated, left a strong impression upon him. On his way in, he passed by the American 2nd Armored Division, some of the men from that group, and it really had a chance to remind him, look, this is what this is all about. This is what these people were fighting for, sacrifice for. I now have to do right by them at the conference table. He met Joseph Stalin the next day, in fact invited Stalin to join him for lunch, made a very good first impression. Truman said, I like Stalin, I can deal with Stalin. He is honest but smart as hell. He later added that Stalin is as near like Tom Pendergast as any man I know, which was definitely a compliment. The formal session began the next day at the Sicilianov Palace. In the middle of the conference room, they had a 12-foot diameter table, 15 chairs going around, 5 for each of the 3 nations. Now, since Truman was both the head of government and head of state, they said that he would be the chair of this conference, which was fine with Truman, and he basically began the conference by following his script. The topics to cover: occupation of Germany, denazification, the trial of war criminals, reaffirming a number of the decisions related to these topics and others that had been made just a few months before at Yalta. But the bigger issues were going to be, what about Eastern Europe, the Baltic states, what about Poland, borders? Stalin had made some commitments, including about free and fair elections in Eastern Europe, but seemed to be backing away from those. And at this point, the Americans and the British had very little leverage because the Soviets were military occupiers now at this point throughout basically all of Eastern Europe. And as Stalin would later say, whoever occupies a territory also imposes on it his own social system. Everyone imposes his own system as far as his army can reach. It cannot be otherwise. In fact, Stalin was insisting on annexing the eastern part of Poland up to the Curzon line, which had basically been agreed to at Yalta. He needed that buffer in case the Germans eventually rearmed and were going to attack. That was what he said. He was not going to concede on that. There was no point. But Truman had then started talking about the rest of Eastern Europe. He said, we're asking for the reorganization of the satellite governments along democratic lines as agreed upon at Yalta. Stalin's response: if a government is not fascist, a government is democratic. Clearly not seeing eye to eye, but again, not much that the Americans and the British could do with the Soviet military so firmly entrenched throughout all of Eastern Europe. Now, in parallel of all this, here in Potsdam, the U.S. Secretary of War, Henry Stimson, got some news that the first atomic bomb explosion as a test was successful in the desert of New Mexico. He gave the update to Harry Truman, the president, who said, as I read the message from Stimson, I realized that the test not only met the most optimistic expectation of the scientists, but that the United States had in its possession an explosive force of unparalleled power. The question was now, Would they use it? Where? When? All of that was going to be ultimately the decision of Harry Truman, and he had a number of folks now he was talking to about that in the American delegation and also the British delegation. Roosevelt and Churchill had been very much partners in this concept of the Manhattan Project. The work was done primarily by the Americans, but it had been a close conversation between the two. So they had these meetings. Situation in the Pacific, frankly, was very ominous. The Americans were carpet bombing the homeland in Japan. Hundreds of thousands were being killed, and there was still no sign that the Japanese were getting ready to surrender, which was kind of consistent throughout the war. Every island that the Americans captured from the Japanese, they basically fought to the death. And at this point, it was clear that the Japanese were conscripting men, women of pretty much all ages to get ready for an American invasion, to try to make that as brutal as possible, perhaps to save their homeland from annihilation. There were a lot of estimates as to what that kind of invasion would cost in terms of casualties. The numbers that Truman basically relied upon that came from the Army were expectation for 500,000 Americans would be killed and 500,000 Japanese would be killed. So about 1 million people were going to die, rough estimates, if the Americans had to invade to bring this war to an end. The point about the atomic bomb is that maybe use something like that, terribly destructive, but it would be so destructive it would shock the Japanese into actually surrendering. Now, some of the comments about this, General George Marshall, the Army Chief of Staff, said the Japanese had demonstrated in each case that they would not surrender and they fight to the death. It was to be expected that resistance in Japan with their home ties could even be more severe. So it seemed quite necessary, if we could, to shock them into action. We had to end the war. We had to save American lives. Again, the British perspective, Winston Churchill made it really clear there was no decision to make. In fact, he said that the historic fact remains and must be judged in the aftertime that the decision whether or not to use the atomic bomb to compel the surrender of Japan was never even an issue. There was unanimous, automatic, unquestioned agreement around our table, nor did I ever hear the slightest suggestion that we should do otherwise. There was some discussion about maybe a demonstration of the atomic bomb rather than dropping it on a Japanese city, maybe dropping it in Tokyo Bay as a demonstration as that shock value, but the general consensus was it wasn't going to work. If you didn't use this on the Japanese people, then it wasn't going to be effective and the Japanese weren't going to surrender. Truman knew ultimately this was up to him. The final decision of where and when to use the atomic bomb was up to me. Let there be no mistake about it. I regarded the bomb as a military weapon, never had any doubt that it should be used. So Truman and Churchill then talked for a moment, and they realized, of course, that Joseph Stalin had been left out of this. It was the big three, but not when it came to the atomic bomb. That had been held between Roosevelt and Churchill. And they agreed it was time to tell Stalin now that the successful test had been taken. So on July the 24th, Truman, in one of these meetings around that conference table, casually walked to the other side, goes up to Stalin and basically tells him about this new catastrophic weapon that the Americans had successfully tested. And he basically got no reaction from Stalin, which surprised people in the American contingency. But the fact is, Stalin knew all about this. His spies had infiltrated the Manhattan Project. He knew everything that was going on. In fact, the only thing he said to Truman was that he hopes that the Americans use it on the Japanese. Beyond that, no reaction, because he already knew. Now, the next day, there was another change in the big three because they had elections in Britain and Winston Churchill was out. There was a big upset. The Labour Party came in and had a victory, so Clement Atlee instantly becomes the new prime minister. Churchill is gone, and Atlee is seated at this table here in Potsdam. And Atlee joined Harry Truman, Chiang Kai-shek from China in issuing the Potsdam Declaration, basically the final warning to the Japanese. It said in part, "We call upon the government of Japan to proclaim now the unconditional surrender of all Japanese armed forces and to provide proper and adequate assurances of their good faith in such action. The alternative for Japan is prompt and utter destruction." Well, to the Japanese, they didn't know about the atomic bomb, and this was nothing new. These kinds of declarations had sort of come their way in the past. They rejected this one like they had in the past, and at that point, Harry Truman approved the use of the atomic bomb against the Japanese, really as soon as the bombs were ready, except not before August 2nd, because that's when the conference was due to wrap up. He wanted that done first. Then, as soon as the army was ready, we'll use the atomic bomb. And by the way, there were no limits placed on this. If the Japanese didn't surrender after the use of the first bomb, they were already approved to use as many bombs as they could until the Japanese did surrender. Now, the fact was the Americans only had 2 more bombs after their test bomb was done that were actually available at this moment in time. So they really only could drop 2, but there were others in production. If they needed them, they would get to those as well and would not need any more authorization from the president the way this was set up. Now, in the last couple of days in the Potsdam Conference, there were some successes, just a final agreement on some key items. First of all, Stalin agreed that Russia would enter the war against Japan, like he had agreed with Roosevelt at Yalta, targeting kind of mid-August for that. He also further agreed that the Russians would participate in the new United Nations and in their seat on the Security Council, and that was important to Truman as well. But again, no concessions really on Eastern Europe. That would be Soviet satellite states for the next 40 years. And there wasn't much the Americans or the British could do about it. Now, one final thing that was kind of personal to Truman, he had been trying to get Stalin to agree to some kind of principle about free access to major waterways around the world. It's something, again, that would constitute long-term peace. The Danube, the Rhine, the Dardanelles, the Suez Canal, the Panama Canal, and a couple of others. He made a last-ditch appeal on the last day to Stalin. Can we put this on the table? And Stalin said, "Yet." No, I would not agree to that, and so Truman could not get that last item on the table. This would be the last meeting between Harry Truman and Joseph Stalin, just the one-time get-together. Distrust would only grow going forward. In fact, it was sort of already underway. Looking back to what had been said at Yalta and what was happening now, self-interest clearly taking over now that the war was over. They did set up a Council of Foreign Ministers that would continue to have discussions on many of these topics to try to iron out the details, but it would be a struggle pretty much every step of the way for the British and the Americans on one side and the Russians on the other. Back onto the Augusta, back home to the United States, they're on that journey on the seas, August the 6th, when Truman is having lunch with Secretary of State Byrnes and a bunch of members of the crew from the Augusta when he gets a message. The bomb had been dropped, successfully used over Hiroshima, Japan, and it was, from a military standpoint, a complete success. Harry Truman, thrilled, gets a message to the crew. The next day, a message to the United States citizens. 16 hours ago, an American airplane dropped 1 bomb on Hiroshima. It is an atomic bomb. It is harnessing of the basic power of the universe. We are now prepared to obliterate more rapidly and completely every productive enterprise the Japanese have above ground in any city. We shall destroy their docks, their factories, their communications. Let there be no mistake. We shall completely destroy Japan's power to make war. If they do not now accept our terms, they may expect a rain of ruin from the air, the like of which has never been seen on this earth, and still no surrender from the Japanese. A couple of days later, August the 8th, the Russians, sensing the end of the war, didn't wait for the middle of the month. They kind of wanted to get into it, so they sent 1 million men into Manchuria. They're now into the war. The next day, August the 9th, still no surrender. The second bomb was dropped. Nagasaki is the end target. It was not the original target that day. Kokura, Japanese city, was the original target, but bad weather, cloudy conditions, poor visibility. They couldn't make sure of where they were going on that, so they actually went to the backup route, Nagasaki, and the bomb was dropped. Truman issued another ultimatum, and this time the Emperor Hirohito stepped in and he said, look, we can't go on anymore. August the 14th, the Japanese capitulated. The signing ceremony took place September the 2nd, 1945 on the USS Missouri, General Douglas MacArthur leading the way for the Allies in the signature of that deal. Now the bomb, well, ultimate responsibility clearly landed with Harry Truman. What were the impact? Hiroshima, 70,000 roughly were killed instantly. Another 50 to 60,000 believed would die before the end of the year. Similar numbers in Nagasaki, between 60 and 80,000 were killed. Many have decried this. Barbaric. People looking back from a historical perspective, it's the only use in world history to date of atomic weapons, were these 2 bombs being dropped. But for Harry Truman, he had no regrets. From his perspective, the atomic bombs dropped on Japan saved lives. Yes, they cost lives, but they saved many more lives. The 1 million men that he expected, 500,000 Americans, 500,000 Japanese, to be killed in an invasion, that number compared to who died in the 2 bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki was much smaller. this was, in a sense, a victory, and this was the only way in the Americans' mind to get the Japanese to surrender short of the full invasion. So yes, he would worry about the atomic bomb, frankly, for the rest of his presidency. Other conflicts that he would be involved in, the atomic bomb was brought up. He had to make decisions around, and of course, never use the bomb again. But in terms of this use case, in Japan, end of World War II, the likelihood of high casualties, immense casualties, if an invasion had occurred, the shock to the Japanese that came from the bomb, this was not only worth it, it was the right decision. Harry Truman never had any regrets about dropping the bombs on Japan. That is Harry Truman, Potsdam and dropping the bomb. From the life of Harry Truman. For more presidential chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles.